China's most successful movie in years swept the box office this summer. Dead to Rights is still showing, pulling audiences into an emotional roller coaster as they witness truly horrific and gruesome scenes of the massacre the Japanese carried out when they occupied Nanjing in 1937 and identify with a group of survivors trying to escape, carrying the photographs that would eventually expose the mass atrocities to the world. It was this emotional tinderbox that Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi ignited when she said a military threat to Taiwan would spur military intervention by the country's self-defense forces. Nearly a month later, commentators continue to ask themselves what on earth Takaichi, the country's new leader, had in mind in blurting out such a provocative statement on such a sensitive issue at the climax of Beijing's year-long campaign marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, which focused on memorializing the 15 to 20 million Chinese who perished at the hands of the Japanese troops. Continentalists ascendant? The most likely explanation, in my view, has to do with Donald Trump, whose visit to Japan in late October was one of the highlights of a week-long swing through the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to Trump's visit, the whole region was apprehensive about Trump's second presidency. Though Trump had declared a trade war on practically all countries, the East Asian countries, the so-called Asian tigers that had built export-powered economies, were his special targets. Nearly all the Southeast Asian countries were penalized with a 19% tariff increase, while Japan and Korea were each punished with a 15% rise under Trump's blanket justification that both enemies of the U.S., like China and its allies, had taken advantage of its American generosity. Washington's Northeast Asian allies, Japan and Korea, however, were concerned with more than trade. Over the last 80 years, they have served as protectorates on the front lines of the American empire in Asia. At the end of the Cold War, they hosted hundreds of bases and facilities from which the U.S. Pacific Command could project power towards the Asian mainland. When Trump brusquely told them to shoulder more of the costs for their defense during his first term, they began to worry about their security umbrella, and they were not unrattled in 2019 when he crossed the demilitarized zone to shake North Korea's Kim Jong-un's hand and pat him on the back. When Trump came back to power earlier this year, the conservative elites in Seoul and Tokyo became alarmed that the old containment policy of the last 80 years had become a bone of contention within the new foreign policy team. They were disconcerted by reports coming out of Washington that, as one analyst summed it up, three factions, too, were struggling for influence in Trump's inner circle. First, the maximalists, a dwindling group that still clings to the dream of global American dominance. Then come the specificists, led by Elbridge Colby and his allies, who believe America must retreat from Europe and the Middle East to focus single-mindedly on China. Finally, the continentalists, or neo-Monroeists, Stephen Miller and Vice President J.D. Vance, chief among them, who advocate an almost hermit-like retrenchment, turning the U.S. into a fortress continent. By mid-year, the Koreans and Japanese were getting really alarmed. Trump seemed to be recognizing Russia's suzerainty in Eastern Europe, the NATO allies were left to fend for themselves in Ukraine, and the U.S. was attacking Venezuelan boats on the pretext that they were drug dealers, while positioning more and more ships, including an aircraft carrier, close to Venezuela. It seemed that the U.S. was putting its military focus on the Western Hemisphere, meaning the isolationists or continentalists were gaining the upper hand. What was especially disconcerting was that no clear policy posture was coming out on the Asia-Pacific from the White House, and while Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of War, visited the region earlier in the year and muttered the old Cold War shibboleths, the fears of Seoul and Tokyo were not assuaged. It seems like Washington was informally adopting a spheres of influence strategy. The visit of Trump in late October on the way to attend the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Seoul provided an opportunity for the Japanese to get more definitive statements from Trump on the future of the U.S. security shield. Takaichi played up to his vanity, promising to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. But all Trump was interested in talking about was more investment by Japanese corporations in the U.S. even when she promised to take the Japan-US alliance to a higher level with President Trump. Japan thrown under the bus? Was Takaichi's throwing off strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan question a move to get Trump to make a more definitive commitment to maintaining or upgrading the military alliance with Tokyo? If the intent of Takaichi's remarks on Taiwan was to elicit a strong affirmation from Trump of the US-Japan security relationship, and that the collective security principle would entail coordination in the event of a Taiwan contingency, she was most likely disappointed. In his account of a telephone conversation between him and Chinese President Xi Jinping a few days after Takaichi's remarks, Trump said he had a very good telephone call with President Xi of China. We discussed many topics, including Ukraine, Russia, fentanyl, soybeans, other farm products, etc. Our relationship with China is extremely strong. There was no mention of support for Takaichi's position, nor even some acknowledgement that the Japan-Taiwan issue was discussed. Equally suggestive was the tone of his post, which was respect for Xi, if not enthusiasm. In a telephone call with Takaichi the next day, instead of giving her the backing she wanted, Trump apparently told her to avoid further actions that might inflame the dispute with Beijing. This was practically an acknowledgement that she was to blame for the row. Reflecting on Trump's comments, a respected analyst, Zhu Feng III, dean of the School of International Studies at Nanjing University, suggested that Washington was unwilling to let the Taiwan issue be used to hijack China-US relations, and that Trump's domestic and foreign policy priorities have not focused on Taiwan or the Asia-Pacific. To many in Japan and the Asia-Pacific, Trump's fawning account of his conversation with Xi and his telling Takaichi to dial down the rhetoric are one more indication that the isolationists or continentalists are ascendant and that Trump is in the process of informally ceding the Asia-Pacific as China's sphere of influence. Indeed, many analysts claim that Trump's non-declaration of support was really an act of throwing Takaichi under the bus. A long winter ahead? Many observers talk about the onset of a long winter in China-Japan relations, and that Tokyo is on the losing end of this protracted conflict. What many Japanese, foremost of which is Takaichi, an unreconstructed hawk, do not seem to understand is that for China, the Second World War is not over, and that Beijing will not ease the pressure until Tokyo cries uncle. For a rapidly aging society that is, in economic terms, being left far behind by its rival, China's GDP is over 4 times that of Japan, that is suffering from technological stagnation, whose military is having a tough time filling its recruitment quotas, and whose protector no longer considers the alliance a priority, that is a very daunting future. Takaichi's poll numbers are said to have gone up, but they're likely to plunge once the pain of having recklessly offended an ascendant nation to whom the country owes a blood debt is felt. Will Takaichi repent and retract her statement? Perhaps before she decides on a definitive course of action, it might be a good idea for her to arrange a special screening of Dead to Rights for herself and her fellow hardline rightists. Better yet, she could arrange for the screening on TV and in movie theaters of Dead to Rights to push the Japanese to finally come to terms with a dark episode in their past that many prefer to erase from the collective memory.